Tim 13 grown men, 3 years on the dusty, unforgiving roads of first-century Galilee. No jobs, no income, no visible means of support. Think about the pure mathematics of it for a second. Somebody was paying those bills, and it was not Jesus performing a miraculous multiplication of loaves and fishes at every single meal. Darian. Wait, what do you mean paying the bills? They were traveling preachers in the ancient world. People gave them food when they came to town. It was hospitality. It was charity. That is what everybody learns. That is the baseline assumption of the entire gospel narrative. Tim. That is the sanitized version, the Sunday school version. The reality is that this was a massive, sustained logistical operation. And it was bankrolled by a very specific group of people. People whose names have been systematically pushed to the margins of the story, reduced to footnotes and bad translations. Darian. That sounds like a conspiracy theory. You are telling me there was a secret funding source. Marcus. Not a secret funding source. An open one that we have simply been trained to ignore. And when you find out who they were and exactly where their money was coming from, it changes the entire story of the first century. Because this was not pocket change. This was structural funding. Marcus, before we continue this conversation, if this kind of historical investigation interests you, hitting subscribe makes sure YouTube sends you more of it, because this conversation is going to get much more intense in a few minutes, and we have a lot of layers to peel back here. Marcus, for 12 years, I taught world history at a Catholic high school in Evansville, Indiana. And one of the things you realize when you teach history, real history, not the mythological versions we prefer, is that movements do not happen in a vacuum. Armies need supply lines. Political campaigns need treasuries. Revolutions require capital. And yet, when we taught the history of early Christianity, we taught it as if it defied the laws of economics. We taught that Jesus and the 12 disciples just wandered around Galilee, and somehow, magically, they were always fed. Tim. The immaculate logistics. Marcus. Exactly. Every Friday we had a ritual at the school, the weekly collection during the chapel mass. I remember sitting in the back row, watching the administrators counting the money afterward. The sheer irony of it always struck me. We spent so much time talking about money in the present, but we never heard a single sermon about who financed Jesus while he was actually alive. Darian. Because that is what the text implies, isn't it? They left their nets, they left their tax booths, they left their livelihoods to follow him. You do not do that if you are worried about your next meal. You do that because you trust that God will provide. Or, practically speaking, that the local villages will provide. Tim. The local villages. Let us talk about those villages. You think peasant communities in first-century Galilee, heavily taxed by the Roman Empire and squeezed by Herod Antipas, had the surplus to feed 13 grown men for weeks at a time. Darian. It was a culture of extreme hospitality. It was a religious duty to welcome the traveler. Tim. Welcoming a traveler for a night is one thing. Funding a 3-year itinerant ministry is a completely different economic reality. You are talking about feeding 13 men. You are talking about clothing them. You are talking about lodging, bribes for safe passage, the sheer cost of constant movement across borders. Hospitality does not cover that. Capital covers that. Let us break down the daily cost. Bread, salted fish, olive oil, wine. For 13 men. Plus the women themselves. Plus the occasional crowds. We are talking about feeding 20 to 30 people a day. A denarius was a day's wage for a laborer. They were burning through capital at an astonishing rate. Darian. Wait, Jesus literally told them to take no money bags when they traveled. He told them to rely on the towns. He fed the 5,000 with a miracle. He found a coin in a fish's mouth to pay the temple tax. The text explicitly says they were poor. Tim. Ah, you are pulling the classic proof texts. Let us dismantle them one by one. The coin in the fish's mouth? That is a localized event for a specific tax. The feeding of the 5,000? That is a miracle for a crowd, not the daily sustenance of the core group. And sending out the 72 without money bags? That was a specific, short-term training mission. It was an exception, which proves the rule. Marcus, if they never carried money bags, why does the Gospel of John explicitly state that Judas Iscariot was the treasurer? You do not need a treasurer if you do not have a treasury. You do not need a man in charge of the money box if there is no money box. And you do not need a money box if you are surviving purely on the daily kindness of strangers. Darian. Okay, I had forgotten about Judas holding the money box, but a money box for small donations is one thing. You are talking about structural funding. You are talking about serious wealth. Marcus. And the text actually tells us exactly where that capital came from. It is just that for 2,000 years, we have trained ourselves to read right past it. Look at Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. It is a famous passage, but mostly because it lists the 12 male disciples. And then, almost as an afterthought in most English translations, it mentions a group of women. Tim, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and, quote, many others. And then comes the phrase that changes everything. Marcus, quote, who provided for them out of their means. Darian? Okay, but provided for them is incredibly vague. It could mean they cooked the meals. It could mean they did the washing. It could mean they brought some bread when the group was in town. It does not mean they were wealthy financiers bankrolling the entire operation. Tim. That is exactly what it means, and the original Greek proves it. Darian. I am going to need to see the evidence for that. That is a massive claim to make based on one vague sentence in English. Marcus. Let us look at the Greek verb used in that sentence. The word is diakoneo. Tim. And that word is a landmine. Marcus. It is the exact same root word that the early church later used to create the official title of deacon. Tim. It does not mean throwing a few coins in a collection plate. It describes sustained, ongoing, structural service and provision. This was an administrative and financial role. According to scholars like John P. Meier, this was not a one-time donation. This was ongoing material support. Marcus Meier concludes that Luke preserves a valuable historical memory here. Devoted women followers accompanied Jesus on his journeys around Galilee and up to Jerusalem, actually supporting him and his entourage with their own money, food, or property. Darian. But even if it means ongoing provision, where is the proof that they had real money? You said they were bankrolling this. Women in the first century were not exactly running hedge funds. They were dependent on their husbands or their fathers. How could they independently fund a movement? Marcus. That is the misconception we bring to the text. We project 19th century Victorian gender roles onto the 1st century Roman Empire. The research of Richard Bauckham on gospel women shows something entirely different. Women in the Second Temple Jewish period could and did possess independent wealth. They could inherit. They could manage estates. They could be patrons of synagogues. The cults of Isis and other Roman mystery religions were already showing that women with capital were flexing their financial muscle to support religious movements. Early Christianity tapped directly into that existing economic network. Tim. And these specific women were not peasants. Let us start with Mary Magdalene. What do you picture when you hear her name? Darian. A poor woman. A prostitute, if you follow the medieval tradition. Someone from a dusty, forgotten fishing village who was saved from a terrible life. Tim. Exactly. That is the narrative. Now look at the archaeology. Marcus. In 2009, the Israel Antiquities Authority was conducting an excavation in Magdala, her hometown, near the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. They were preparing the ground to build a retreat center. They expected to find a modest, perhaps impoverished village. Tim, instead, they hit something hard. Marcus. They uncovered a first-century synagogue with elaborate decorations, including a carved stone that is now famous as the Magdala stone. But they did not just find a synagogue. They found villas. They found intricate, expensive mosaic floors. They found a marketplace. Magdala was a center of wealth. It was a highly prosperous fishing and trade hub. It was an industrial center for salted fish that was exported all over the Roman world. Tim. So when you hear Mary of Magdala, you should not be picturing a destitute outcast. You should be picturing a woman from a wealthy, cosmopolitan trading hub. A woman with resources. A woman with capital. Think about what that meant logistically. If she was connected to the garum trade, the salted fish trade, she had connections with merchants, ship captains, and bankers. She did not just have a few coins in a pouch. She had a network. She had lines of credit. She could secure lodging and supplies across the region simply through her trading contacts. Darian. Okay, I have to admit that this data is strong. The archaeology is there. But one rich woman from a trade town does not mean the whole movement was funded by wealthy women. And it certainly does not mean they had the kind of structural power you are implying. I need to see more before I change my mind. Tim. You are right. One woman does not prove the rule. So let us look at the second name on that list. Joanna. Darian. Joanna. I have barely even heard of her. Tim. Most people have not. And there is a very good reason for that, because Joanna is the most dangerous person in the entire gospel narrative. Marcus. And here is where the conversation changes level. Because Joanna was not just a wealthy merchant, Joanna was connected to the absolute highest levels of political power in the region. Tim Luke tells us exactly who she was. He says she was the wife of Chusa. Darian. And who is Chusa? Marcus. To answer that, we have to look outside the Bible. We have to look at the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who documented the administrative structure of the Herodian dynasty. Chusa was the steward of Herod Antipas. The Greek word is epitropos. Tim. He was the manager of the royal household, the finance minister, the man who managed the wealth of the Herodian client kingdom in Galilee. Darian. Wait, are you telling me that the wife of Herod's own finance minister was following Jesus around? Tim. Not just following him, funding him, with Herodian money. Darian. I do not have a good answer for this. This is uncomfortable, but keep going. Marcus. Think about the political reality of this. Think about the stakes. Herod Antipas is the ruler of Galilee. He is the man who had John the Baptist beheaded because John was causing too much political unrest. He views any populist movement with extreme suspicion. He eventually views Jesus as a direct threat. Tim. And while Herod is sitting in his palace in Tiberias, with its Roman baths and its imported marble, trying to figure out how to stop this rogue preacher, his own finance minister's wife is secretly funneling the money that keeps that preacher's ministry alive. Darian. That is not just charity. That is treason. If Herod found out, that is a death sentence. For her, and probably for her husband. Marcus. Exactly. This is not a story about poor women handing out bread. This is a story about women with immense wealth and political access taking enormous personal and political risks to fund a movement they believed in. And think about the sheer volume of resources required. They were not just funding a local group. Jesus and his disciples were constantly on the move, from Capernaum to Jerusalem, through Samaria into the Decapolis. Travel in the ancient world was not free. It was dangerous and it was expensive. You needed supplies. You needed pack animals. You needed security. You needed to pay tolls on the Roman roads. Tim. Imagine the psychological toll on Joanna. She is taking money that ultimately derives from the Herodian household and giving it to a man that Herod called a fox. How did she hide the accounting? She had to have secret ledgers. She had to move the funds without her husband noticing. Or perhaps Chusa was a secret sympathizer himself. The text does not say. But either way, this was high-stakes espionage and financial subversion happening right under the nose of the Roman client state. Darian. That means whoever was funding them had to have liquid assets, not just land, but cash. Marcus. Exactly. And that is why Joanna's connection to Chusa is so critical. The Herodian economy was entirely cash-based. Taxes were collected in coin. As the wife of the finance minister, she had access to liquid capital in a way that almost no one else in Galilee did. Tim. And patronage in the Roman world was not anonymous. A patron owned their client. The patron got the glory for whatever the client did. If you funded a philosopher, his ideas were credited to your generosity. Darian. So by funding Jesus, these women were essentially taking political ownership of his movement? Marcus. Yes, but Jesus flipped the script. In the Roman system, the patron held the power. In this movement, the patrons were serving the client. It was an inversion of the entire social order of the empire. And that made it doubly dangerous. And Tim. And they did not just send money from a distance. The text says they traveled with him. Marcus. According to historians like Kathleen Corley, it was not completely unheard of for wealthy women to serve as patrons for traveling rabbis in Second Temple Judaism. They would send funds. They would offer their homes. But to actually leave their homes? To travel on the dusty roads of Galilee with a group of men? Tim. That was scandalous. That was social suicide. They were abandoning their comfortable villas, their mosaics, and their social status to walk the roads with a man the authorities considered a dangerous radical. Darian. And where were the men during all this? The disciples? They were arguing about who would be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. While the women were paying the bills, the men were arguing over imaginary thrones. Marcus. But it is accurate to the text. The writers of the Gospels did not hide the incompetence of the disciples, but they also did not highlight the competence of the women. They left it in the background, hoping we would just focus on the miracles. And it is entirely possible that this caused massive internal friction. In the apocryphal texts, like the Gospel of Mary, we see Peter constantly fighting with Mary Magdalene, furious that she holds so much authority. That authority was not just spiritual, it was almost certainly financial. The men who left their nets resented the women who brought the gold. Darian. I came into this conversation thinking I knew the story. I thought they were just poor, faithful women doing what they could. I did not know any of this. I did not know about Chusa. I did not know about Magdala. I did not know the sheer cost of keeping 13 men on the road for 3 years. Marcus. Remember what you said at the beginning? That everybody learns they were just traveling preachers living off hospitality? Tim. That is exactly what everybody learns. And that is exactly the function of the narrative. Not to inform, but to control. To erase the fact that the entire foundation of the movement was built on the capital and the courage of women. Darian. I cannot refute that. And honestly, I do not want to try anymore. The evidence is overwhelming. But why? Why erase them? Why hide the money? Marcus. Because as the early church grew, and as it integrated into the Roman Empire, it became an institution run entirely by men. Men who were comfortable with the idea of male apostles, male bishops, and male authority. And this is where the silence becomes deafening. If you look at the later texts, the pastoral epistles, letters like Timothy and Titus, written decades after the original movement, the tone completely shifts. Suddenly, women are being told to stay silent in the churches, to focus on domestic duties. Tim. They were systematically pushing women out of the power structures they had helped create. But they had a massive problem. The historical memory was too strong. People remembered that women had funded the movement. People remembered Mary Magdalene and Joanna. Marcus. So they had a choice. They could not completely erase the women from the texts because the texts were already in circulation. But they could reframe them. They could change the lens through which those women were viewed. Tim. The idea that the Son of God, the Savior of the world, was completely dependent on the financial support of a group of wealthy, powerful women that did not fit the patriarchal structure they were building. It was embarrassing to them. It threatened their authority. Marcus. So they minimized it. They translated diakoneo as serving instead of funding. They reduced a word that meant structural administrative provision into a word that sounded like cooking and cleaning. They painted Mary Magdalene as a repentant prostitute instead of a wealthy patron from a thriving industrial town. They ignored Joanna completely, despite her explosive connection to the Herodian court. They built a narrative of 13 poor men changing the world by themselves, and they left out the women who paid for the entire thing. Tim. And it worked. For 2,000 years, we have visualized a penniless Jesus and his poor disciples, wandering from town to town, never asking how they survived, never asking who bought the food, never asking who paid the tolls. Darian. We were taught the names of 12 fishermen. We memorized their names in Sunday school, but we were never taught the names of the women who kept them alive. I entered this conversation with a certainty. I thought the lack of money was a sign of divine providence. I leave with another certainty. And the second one is much heavier. The providence was real, but it came in the form of female capital, not magic. Tim. And this extends far beyond the logistics of the Gospels. Think about the economic impact of these women when the movement moved to the cities. When Paul was writing to the Romans, who did he commend? Phoebe, a benefactor, a patron from Cenchreae. When the church was established in Philippi, who was the very first convert and financier? Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth, a woman of extreme independent wealth. The pattern that began with Joanna and Mary Magdalene became the structural blueprint for the entire first century. Marcus. That is a fascinating parallel. It shows that the financial model of the movement was consistent. It relied on female capital from day one in Galilee, and it relied on female capital decades later in Greece and Rome. But as the centuries passed, the church began to look more and more like the Roman Empire it once opposed. And in the Roman Empire, men hold the money and men hold the power. Darian. It is incredible how effective that erasure was. I sat through years of history classes, years of sermons, and not once did anyone connect the dots. The 12 disciples were presented as the ultimate heroes of faith because they left everything behind. But nobody ever asked what they were walking towards. They were walking into an infrastructure that was already built and paid for by someone else. Tim. Exactly. And that is why this history matters. Because when you restore the economics to the story, you restore the women to the story. You stop seeing them as passive observers who just happen to be standing by the cross, and you start seeing them as the architects of the movement's survival. Marcus. They bought the time that Jesus needed to teach. They bought the protection that the disciples needed to travel. They bought the physical space where the early church was born. And they did it knowing that if the authorities found out, it would cost them everything. Darian. Let us talk about that cost for a second. If Chusa, the steward of Herod Antipas, found out that his wife was funneling the estate's resources to this rogue rabbi, what would actually happen? I mean, historically speaking. Marcus. Historically speaking, it would have been catastrophic. Herod Antipas was already executing dissidents. John the Baptist was beheaded because he criticized Herod's marriage. Imagine what Herod would do if he discovered that his own inner circle was financing a movement that claimed a new king was arriving. Treason in the Roman world was not punished with a fine. It was punished with crucifixion, confiscation of all property, and the destruction of the entire family line. Joanna was playing an incredibly dangerous game. She was living in the palace, dining with the elites, smiling at the officials, while quietly undermining their entire power structure by funding the one man who threatened to overturn it all. That is not just piety. That is political brilliance. That is subversion on the highest possible level. Darian, I will never look at the story of the 12 disciples the same way again. The courage it took for a fisherman to leave his net is one thing, but the courage it took for Joanna to use the wealth of the man who wanted Jesus dead to keep Jesus alive. That is a completely different level of defiance. Tim, it is the kind of defiance that changes the course of human history. The kind of defiance that institutions spend 2,000 years trying to make us forget. Marcus. But they did not succeed. The text is still there, sitting in plain sight in Luke chapter 8. All we have to do is read it without the filter they put over our eyes. Marcus. And that completely changes how we view the end of the story. Think about the crucifixion. When the 12 male disciples, the ones who get all the credit, fled in terror, who stayed? The women. Why did the women go to the tomb on Sunday morning to anoint the body? Because that was their responsibility. They were the ones who handled the logistics. They were the ones who bought the spices. It was their financial operation from start to finish. Tim. They did not just follow the movement. They made the movement possible, from the first days in Galilee to the absolute end in Jerusalem. Darian, without the wealth and the courage of those women, there would be no ministry of Jesus. Marcus, I want to pause here for a moment. If you are watching this, you are not just a spectator. You are someone who wants to know the history that was kept out of the textbooks. We do this research independently because institutions do not want to fund this kind of questioning. If you found value in what we just uncovered about Joanna and Mary, consider using the Super Thanks button below. It is how we keep the lights on and keep digging into the archives to bring these stories back to the surface. Marcus. And there is a lot more to uncover. We have put together a 5-volume library called the Spinoza Forever Library. It dives deep into the historical texts, the suppressed documents, and the real history of the first century. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Marcus. So I have to ask you, what shocked you more today? The fact that the movement was fundamentally dependent on money, or the fact that it was women from the enemy's court who were paying for it? Tell me when you first realized that the Sunday school version of the story did not add up. The conversation continues in the comments. I will see you there.